One text message. That's all it takes. Not one screaming match in the office. Not one dramatic resignation. Not one big mistake in front of the whole company. Sometimes the thing that destroys your credibility, weakens your legal protection, or gives your employer the perfect excuse to fire you is one message you sent in 10 seconds because you were tired, emotional, trying to keep the peace, or simply not thinking about how that message might look later. And that's the dangerous part, because when most people text their coworkers, they think like coworkers. They think casually. They think emotionally. They think, this is private. This is just between us. This is me venting. This is me being polite. This is me joking around. This is no big deal. But if things ever go bad at work, if you get pushed out, retaliated against, harassed, denied a promotion, written up unfairly, or fired, those same texts stop being casual. They stop being harmless. They stop being just messages. They become evidence. And once a lawyer, HR, investigator, judge, or company decision maker is reading your words without your tone, without your facial expression, and without your private intentions, the meaning of that text can change fast. A message you thought made you look friendly can make it seem like you welcomed misconduct. A message you thought was just venting can make it seem like you had a bad attitude. A message you thought was private can suddenly become the company's strongest defense against you. That's why this conversation matters so much. Because there are certain texts people send to coworkers every day without realizing those messages can sabotage a harassment complaint, destroy a retaliation case, reduce a settlement, or hand an employer a clean justification to say, no, we didn't fire this person unfairly. We fired them because of this. And by the time most people learn that lesson, it's too late. The messages are already sent. Screenshots already exist. Chat logs are already backed up. And the person they trusted to keep it private may one day be forced to turn it all over. So in this video, we're going to walk through 4 types of texts you should never send to coworkers if you care about protecting your job, protecting your reputation, and protecting yourself if the workplace ever turns against you. And I want you to listen carefully, because some of these are not obvious. In fact, one of the most dangerous messages on this list is the exact kind of reply people send when they're trying to avoid conflict and keep things smooth. If you've ever sent a ha-ha, a laughing emoji, and I'm good, a rant about your boss, or a quick message asking a coworker to cover for something they shouldn't, this video is for you. And before we get into the first one, I want to ask you something. Have you ever sent a work text and later thought, I probably shouldn't have put that in writing? Drop a comment below with just one word. Yes if you've done it, or no if you've always been careful. I really want to see how many people have had that moment. Number 1, the just laugh it off text. This is the one that catches people off guard the most because it often comes from a good intention. Let's say a coworker, manager, client, or someone above you sends you something inappropriate. Maybe it's a sexual joke. Maybe it's a comment about your body. Maybe it's flirtatious in a way that makes you uncomfortable. Maybe it's one of those messages that isn't graphic enough to feel easy to report, but it still leaves you with that tight feeling in your stomach because you know it crossed the line. And in that moment, instead of confronting it, you do what so many people do in workplaces every day. You smooth it over. You reply with a laughing emoji. You type LOL. You say, haha, stop. You say, I'm fine. You send a smiley face. You act casual because you don't want things to get weird. You don't want conflict. You don't want retaliation. You don't want to seem dramatic. You don't want to upset someone who has more power than you. So you try to survive the moment socially, and you tell yourself you'll deal with how you really feel later. That reaction is incredibly human. It's common, it's understandable, and in real life, people do it because they're trying to stay safe, keep the peace, and avoid making the situation worse. But legally and professionally, that safe reply can become very dangerous. Because when harassment claims are investigated, one of the biggest questions is whether the conduct was unwelcome. That word matters. Unwelcome. If you later report sexual harassment, hostile work environment, or repeated inappropriate conduct, The company's lawyers or the other side's lawyers, if it becomes a legal case, will look for anything they can use to argue that you did not actually object to the behavior. They want evidence that the interaction was mutual, tolerated, welcomed, or at least not clearly resisted. And what do people often hand them? A text thread full of, haha, you're crazy. Low stop. It's okay. I'm fine. Now let's be clear. A nervous laugh does not mean consent. A polite response does not automatically mean you were comfortable. A woman or man trying to de-escalate an uncomfortable moment is not inviting harassment. Real life is messy. Power dynamics are real. And people often smile through situations that make them deeply uncomfortable. But evidence doesn't always tell the emotional truth of the moment. Evidence tells the written version of the moment. And the written version can be weaponized against you. Imagine this scenario. A manager keeps making comments that feel personal and inappropriate. At first, it's subtle. Then it becomes more direct. One night he texts, "You always look too good to be working this late." You feel gross reading it. You don't want to encourage it, but you also don't want to anger your boss. So you reply, "Haha, I'm just trying to survive this shift." Months later, after more comments, more pressure, and more discomfort, you finally report him. You explain that the behavior was unwanted and made work miserable. What happens next? That text may be printed out and put right in front of you. And someone may say, "If this comment made you uncomfortable, why did you respond like this? If you felt harassed, why were you joking back? You never told him to stop. You never said it was inappropriate. You seemed to engage with it." You laughed. That doesn't mean your complaint is automatically invalid. It doesn't mean you have no case, and it definitely doesn't mean what happened to you was acceptable. But it does mean you have now given the other side an argument. You've made their job easier. You've allowed them to muddy the waters around whether the behavior was truly unwelcome, whether they had notice, and whether you clearly objected. And once that happens, the case often becomes less about what the person did and more about how your responses can be interpreted. That is exactly what you want to avoid. Because in a workplace dispute, especially one involving harassment, ambiguity is expensive. Ambiguity gives cover to bad actors. Ambiguity gives HR room to minimize what happened. Ambiguity gives defense lawyers a script. So what should you do instead? You do not need to write a dramatic legal essay. You do not need to threaten anyone. You do not need to explode emotionally in writing. But if a message crosses the line and you want to protect yourself, your response should do one important thing. It should make your discomfort clear without creating unnecessary chaos. Something as simple as, "I'm not comfortable with comments like that. Please keep our messages work-related. That comment was inappropriate. I'd prefer to keep this professional. Please don't send me messages like that." Notice the difference. Those responses are calm. They're professional. They're not insulting. They're not emotional. But they do something incredibly important. They remove ambiguity. They make it much harder for the other person to later claim you welcomed the conduct. They create a written record showing that the behavior was not invited, not appreciated, and not acceptable to you. And even if you're too uncomfortable to respond in the moment, and that happens, because not everyone feels safe pushing back directly, then at the very least, don't send a message that looks like approval. That's the key. If you can't say stop, don't say haha. If you can't confront it directly, don't create the appearance that you enjoyed it. If you're frozen, scared, or trying to think, silence is often safer than fake comfort, because fake comfort can be turned into fake consent in the story they tell about you later. And this matters beyond just lawsuits. Even inside a company investigation, HR is often looking at screenshots, Slack messages, Teams chats, text threads, and email chains trying to reconstruct what happened. If your messages make it look like you were participating in the tone, playing along, or treating the interaction like a joke, some investigators will lean on that heavily, especially if the company is trying to protect a manager or avoid liability. That's why you have to think one step ahead. Not just, how do I survive this moment? But, if I ever have to explain this message to HR, to an employment lawyer, or to a judge, how will it sound without my fear attached to it? That question alone can save you. And here's the deeper truth. People who behave inappropriately at work often rely on social discomfort to protect themselves. They know most people don't want confrontation. They know many employees will laugh things off, minimize it, or try to stay likable. They know power makes people hesitate, and every soft reply gives them more room to continue. So, one of the smartest professional habits you can build is this. Stop using politeness to document things you don't actually accept. You can be tactful without being misleading. You can be calm without sounding comfortable. You can protect your peace without writing the other side's defense for them. Because once you hit send, you're not just communicating with the person in front of you anymore. You may be communicating with HR 6 months from now, with an investigator a year from now, with a lawyer who is actively looking for a way to tear your credibility apart. And if that sounds extreme, remember this. Workplace problems rarely announce themselves in advance. Most people don't know they're building an evidence trail until the relationship with the company collapses. That's why you have to protect yourself before you need protection. So the next time someone at work sends something inappropriate, ask yourself one simple question before you reply. Will this message make it clear that I was uncomfortable, or will it make it easier for them to pretend I wasn't? That one pause can change everything. And I want to ask you something here, because this is where so many people struggle. Do you think it's fair to expect employees to respond clearly in uncomfortable situations at work? Or do you think most people naturally laugh things off just to survive the moment? Tell me in the comments. Fair or unfair? I'm curious where you stand on that. Text. ID igual a L 9V 9x5. Number 2. Telling coworkers you're looking for another job. This one seems harmless on the surface because, in normal life, telling a coworker you're applying somewhere else feels like one of the most ordinary conversations in the world. You trust someone at work. You vent to them. You tell them you're fed up. You mention that you've updated your resume. You say you've been interviewing. You text them that you're hoping to get out soon. Maybe you even tell them you already have an offer, or that you turned one down because you were trying to give your current employer one more chance. To most employees, that just sounds like life. It sounds like stress, honesty, and career planning. But if your job situation ever turns into a legal fight, especially a claim involving retaliation, discrimination, harassment, or what's called constructive discharge, those messages can become far more damaging than people realize. So let's start with the big concept here. Constructive discharge is the legal idea that an employee didn't truly choose to resign in a free and voluntary way. Instead, the working conditions became so intolerable that a reasonable person would feel forced to quit. In other words, the company may not have officially fired you, but the environment became so toxic, hostile, retaliatory, or abusive that quitting was essentially your only realistic option. That kind of claim can matter a lot, because companies often try to protect themselves by saying, "We didn't terminate this person. They left on their own." If they can successfully frame your departure as a personal career decision instead of a forced response to mistreatment, that can weaken your case dramatically, and this is where your texts come in. Imagine you're dealing with a terrible situation at work. Maybe your manager is retaliating against you after a complaint. Maybe you're being sidelined, humiliated, overworked, or harassed. Maybe your health is being wrecked by the stress. Maybe you've reached the point where you feel trapped and desperate to escape. During that period, you text a coworker, "I'm applying everywhere right now. I just need a better paying job. I can't wait to get out of here. I've got an interview next week. If this other company offers me more money, I'm gone. I'm trying to make a move before the end of the month." At the time, you're just talking. You're sharing what's happening. You're trying to survive. You're letting off pressure with someone you trust. But if you later claim that you resigned because the company made your working conditions intolerable, those messages can be used to tell a completely different story. The employer's version may sound like this. This employee wasn't forced out by misconduct. They were already planning to leave. They were actively pursuing other opportunities for personal reasons. They wanted higher pay, a better title, or a different company. They didn't resign because the environment was intolerable. They resigned because they wanted something else. And suddenly, instead of the spotlight being on the retaliation, the harassment, the discrimination, or the hostile treatment you experienced, the spotlight shifts to your exit strategy. The company tries to reframe your departure as ambition instead of pressure, as career movement instead of legal harm, as personal choice instead of forced resignation. Now, to be clear, looking for another job does not automatically destroy a legitimate claim. People search for new work all the time because their current workplace has become unbearable. In fact, that's often exactly what someone does when they're being mistreated. They try to escape. So the reality is more nuanced than employers sometimes pretend. But again, the problem is not reality by itself. The problem is what your written messages allow the other side to argue. And the more your texts sound like, "I'm leaving because I found something better," the easier it becomes for them to blur the real reason you left. That's why wording matters so much. If you're in a bad situation at work and you're talking to coworkers about leaving, understand that every casual message can become part of a larger narrative later. A message saying, "I'm interviewing because this place is destroying my mental health and I don't think I can safely stay here," creates a very different record from, "I'm trying to bounce for a bigger paycheck." One points toward intolerable conditions, the other points toward personal opportunity. And if all the company has are your casual texts about wanting better money, better hours, or a new challenge, they may use those messages to bury the fact that you were also being mistreated. Now, there's another layer here that people almost never think about: mitigation of damages. If you ever sue an employer and seek lost wages, the law often expects you to make reasonable efforts to reduce your financial losses by looking for comparable work. That's called mitigating damages. In simple terms, if you lost income because of what happened at work, you generally can't just sit back and let the losses pile up if you had a fair opportunity to find replacement employment. And this is where people sometimes make a second mistake in writing. They tell coworkers things like, "I got another offer but turned it down. I could have left already, but I didn't want to. I'm not taking that job even though it pays well. I had a chance to move, but I passed on it." Why does that matter? Because if you later seek compensation for lost pay, the employer may point to those messages and argue that you failed to reduce your damages. Their position may be, even if something improper happened, this employee had a real chance to replace their income and chose not to. So why should we be responsible for the full amount of lost wages? Again, context matters. Maybe the offer wasn't comparable. Maybe it required relocation. Maybe it was unstable, unsafe, or a major step backward. Maybe there were good reasons to decline it. But once you've casually written, "Yeah, I turned down a job," you've now created another issue that may need to be explained, defended, and unpacked. That's what people miss about workplace texts. Every sloppy sentence creates cleanup work later. Now let's make this practical. Suppose you're being retaliated against after reporting discrimination. Your boss starts excluding you, criticizing everything you do, and making your life miserable. You begin looking for a way out because staying feels unbearable. If you text a coworker, "I'm trying to leave because this place is becoming impossible after what happened," that is very different from texting, "I'm done here if someone offers me 10 grand more." Both may reflect truth in some way, but one documents the pressure of the environment. The other gives the company a much easier defense. Or imagine you tell a coworker, "I actually had another offer last month, but I stayed because I thought things might improve." That may sound innocent, but it can also open the door to multiple arguments. The employer may try to say, "So you weren't forced out at all, you had options and stayed voluntarily." Or, "You could have reduced your damages by leaving earlier, but you chose not to." Do you see the pattern? It's not that every one of these arguments will win. It's that your own messages keep giving the other side material to work with. And that's exactly what you want to stop doing. So what's the safer approach? First, understand that you do not owe your coworkers a live play-by-play of your exit strategy. You do not need to text people every time you update your resume, apply for a job, schedule an interview, reject an offer, or plan your departure. The more people you tell, the more discoverable statements you create, the more screenshots can float around, and the more your intentions can be reinterpreted later. Second, if you are in a workplace situation that may become serious retaliation, discrimination, harassment, forced resignation, pay disputes, anything that may one day involve HR or legal counsel, be extremely careful about how you describe why you want to leave. There is a major difference between saying, "I'm exploring options because the situation here has become very difficult," and saying, "I'm out the second I get a better offer." One preserves the connection between the workplace conditions and your decision-making. The other invites the company to claim money was your real motivation. Third, stop putting unnecessary details in writing. Your coworker does not need to know the salary another company offered you. They do not need to know how many places you've applied. They do not need to know that you rejected one offer and are waiting on another. They do not need to know your timeline, your leverage, your frustration, or your private calculations unless there is a very specific reason to share it. And even then, text is often the worst place to do it. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Coworkers are not your vault. Some coworkers mean well but panic when HR questions them. Some want to protect themselves. Some will hand over screenshots the second they feel their own job is at risk. Some won't even do it maliciously. They'll simply be compelled to turn over records during an investigation, internal review, or legal discovery process. So that private text about your job search may not stay private at all. And I want to emphasize something important here. Protecting yourself does not mean lying. It does not mean pretending you're happy. It does not mean you should never look for another job. It does not mean you must suffer in silence while a workplace gets worse. It means being strategic about the record you create. If the real reason you're leaving is that the workplace has become toxic, retaliatory, discriminatory, or unbearable, don't accidentally write a cleaner story for the company than the truth would give them. Don't turn your own evidence into a weapon against yourself. Don't reduce a serious workplace problem to, "I just found something better," if that isn't the full picture. Because once the company can point to your texts and say, "See, they were leaving for their own reasons," you've made it easier for them to erase everything that led up to that point. And this is one of the hardest things for employees to accept. Your employer does not need your messages to be perfectly false in order to use them against you. They only need them to be incomplete, casual, or easy to spin. That's why discipline matters so much. Before you text a coworker about your job search, ask yourself, if this message were read out loud in a deposition, would it make my reasons for leaving clearer, or would it make them easier to distort? That's the filter. Not, do I trust this coworker? Not, will they probably keep it secret? Not, am I just venting for a second? The real question is, if this message leaves my phone and ends up in front of the people least motivated to see my side fairly, can I live with how it sounds? If the answer is no, don't send it. And I want to pause here because this is where I think a lot of people split. If your workplace becomes toxic, do you think it's okay to tell trusted coworkers you're job hunting? Or do you think that should stay completely private no matter how close you are to them? Drop your answer in the comments. Share it or keep it private. I'm genuinely curious what most people would do. Text ID igual a T3R4M1. Number 3. Venting about your boss in writing. This is the kind of mistake that feels amazing for about 30 seconds and then becomes a disaster the moment someone else reads it. You've had a brutal day. Your manager embarrassed you in a meeting, ignored your message, blamed you for something that wasn't your fault, changed expectations without warning, or treated you like you were disposable. You walk away angry, humiliated, and full of adrenaline. So you do what a lot of people do. You open your phone and text the one coworker who gets it, and the message comes out fast. My boss is a clown. She's completely incompetent. He's a psycho. I swear this woman has no idea what she's doing. I hate this place. This team is a joke. If he talks to me like that again, I'm going to lose it. Management is full of idiots. In the moment, it feels harmless because it feels true. It feels private. It feels deserved. You're not trying to build a legal record. You're trying to release pressure before you explode. And to be honest, almost everyone who has worked under a bad boss understands that urge. The problem is that your emotional truth and your legal exposure are not the same thing. Because if your employment situation later turns into a dispute, whether that's a termination, a retaliation complaint, a discrimination case, a hostile work environment claim, or even just an internal HR investigation, those venting messages can become some of the most useful evidence the company has against you. Why? Because employers almost always want an alternative explanation for why they disciplined you, denied you something, or let you go. If you say, I was retaliated against after I complained, if you say, I was targeted because of discrimination, if you say, they were trying to push me out, if you say, the reason they gave for firing me was fake, the company's goal is often to respond with something like this. No, this wasn't retaliation. No, this wasn't discrimination. No, this wasn't because they spoke up. This employee had a pattern of poor judgment. They were disrespectful. They were unprofessional. They had a bad attitude. They were disruptive. They weren't a team player. They showed hostility toward leadership. We had legitimate concerns about their conduct. And what better way to support that story than with your own messages, calling your boss a clown, insulting management, mocking the company, or threatening to snap? This is where a lot of employees accidentally help the employer build what looks like a clean, non-discriminatory reason for taking action against them. In employment disputes, there's often a battle over what the real reason was. Maybe the company says they fired you for attitude, insubordination, or professionalism issues. You say that reason is just a cover story, a pretext to hide retaliation or discrimination. That battle matters because if you can show the employer's explanation is fake, that can be powerful evidence in your favor. But if your own texts are full of contemptuous comments, personal insults, and aggressive language, you make it much easier for the company to say, see, we weren't inventing concerns about attitude. The employee's own messages prove it. Now, that doesn't mean employees aren't allowed to be angry. It doesn't mean managers can mistreat people and then hide behind the fact that the employee privately complained. And it doesn't mean every critical message about a boss automatically justifies discipline. But once again, the issue is not whether your frustration was understandable. The issue is how your written words can be framed once they leave your control. Imagine this scenario. You report discrimination to HR. After that, your boss becomes colder, more critical, and more hostile. You believe you're being retaliated against. A few weeks later, after another humiliating interaction, you text a coworker. This guy is such a joke. I can't stand him. He's the worst manager I've ever had. And honestly, I hope this whole department burns. That night, you feel better because you got it out. Months later, you're terminated. The company claims you had ongoing professionalism problems and were creating negativity on the team. You believe that's nonsense and that the real reason was retaliation for your complaint. Then your texts come out, and now the company has an exhibit showing you insulting your manager, expressing hostility toward the department, and using language they can characterize as toxic, disrespectful, or destabilizing. Do you see the problem? Even if the boss truly was retaliating against you, even if your anger was fully understandable, even if your text was sent privately to one trusted person, the company can still use that message to make its explanation sound more legitimate. That's what makes venting in writing so dangerous. It doesn't just capture your emotions, it hands the employer a document they can point to and say, this is who this employee really was. And the more dramatic your wording, the easier that becomes. Calling your boss unfair is one thing. Calling him a pathetic clown who deserves to get destroyed is another. Saying you feel unsupported is one thing. Saying the whole leadership team is garbage is another. Saying you're frustrated is one thing. Writing, I'm going to go off on her if she says one more thing to me, is something else entirely. When people are angry, they don't write like future witnesses. They write like injured human beings. And unfortunately, injured human beings often create the exact kind of language that looks terrible when isolated on a screen. Now let's talk about the phrase, not a team player, because this is one of the most common labels companies use when they want to sanitize a more questionable decision. Not collaborative, negative attitude, poor professionalism, disruptive, difficulty working with leadership, undermining management. Those phrases are vague on purpose. They sound reasonable. They sound neutral, They sound like ordinary performance concerns, but sometimes they're used to cover retaliation, silence complaints, or justify getting rid of someone who became inconvenient. And if the company can pair those labels with your messages insulting leadership, mocking the workplace, or trashing your boss, it becomes much harder to argue those labels were completely made up. That's why discipline in communication matters most when you're the angriest. Not because your anger isn't valid, not because you have to become fake, not because you owe abusive management politeness in your private thoughts, but because rage in writing is a gift to people who may already be looking for a reason to discredit you. So what's the smarter move? If you need to vent, do it in a way that doesn't create a permanent record that can be turned against you. That may mean talking in person to someone you trust instead of texting them. It may mean stepping outside and calling a friend who does not work there. It may mean journaling privately for yourself instead of sending the message. It may mean taking 20 minutes to cool down before saying anything at all. And if you do need to document a problem in writing, the tone should be completely different from a vent. A vent says, "My boss is a clown and a liar." A useful record says, "My manager raised his voice at me in front of the team today and blamed me for an issue I had previously flagged. I'm concerned about the pattern and want to keep a record of it." A vent says, "She's insane and impossible to work with." A useful record says, "My supervisor changed the deadline after the fact and criticized me for missing a timeline that had not been communicated earlier." Do you hear the difference? One creates heat, the other creates evidence. One expresses emotion in a way that can be used to attack your character. The other captures conduct in a way that can support your credibility. That distinction is everything. Because when you're in a difficult workplace, you need to stop thinking of writing as emotional release and start thinking of it as strategic record making. Every written sentence should either help you, do nothing, or hurt you. If it hurts you, it doesn't belong in a chat with a coworker. And there's another reason this matters. Coworker loyalty is fragile under pressure. The person you rant to today may not be malicious. They may genuinely care about you. They may have vented right back. They may have told you 100 times, "Don't worry, I'd never show anyone our messages." But if HR interviews them, if the company subpoenas communications in a legal case, if they get scared that they'll be dragged into the conflict, if they think protecting themselves requires cooperation, those messages can surface. And once they do, it doesn't matter how therapeutic the conversation felt at the time. It doesn't matter that it happened after work. It doesn't matter that you were exhausted and hurt. It doesn't matter that your boss really was behaving badly. What matters is that the written record now exists, and someone else gets to frame what it means. So here's the rule. I want you to remember, never write the angry version of yourself into evidence. Feel it? Yes. Talk it out? Maybe. Document the facts? Absolutely. Text a coworker that your boss is a worthless clown and the whole company can burn? No, because the second you put contempt in writing, you risk turning a legitimate workplace complaint into a credibility problem. You give the employer something concrete, emotional, and visually powerful to wave around whenever they want to explain away what they did to you. And the worst part is that the message often isn't even necessary. It doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't protect you. It doesn't improve your position. It only relieves pressure for a moment while creating risk that can last for years. So the next time you're furious after a meeting, before you text your coworker, pause and ask, am I documenting what happened, or am I documenting my anger? If it's just anger, don't send it. And I want to ask you this, because I know people are split on it. Do you think private venting about a bad boss is normal and harmless, or do you think it's too risky once it's in writing? Put it in the comments. Normal or too risky? I want to know where you land on this one. Text ID equals M7K2P8. Number 4, asking a coworker to break the rules for you. If the first 3 types of messages can weaken your position, this one can completely blow it up. Because this is the category of text that doesn't just make you look emotional, careless, or inconsistent. This is the kind of message that can hand the company an entirely separate reason to say, even if something unfair happened here, we still would have fired this employee anyway. And that matters more than most people realize. Let's say you're being harassed, discriminated against, retaliated against, or pushed out unfairly. Maybe your employer really did violate the law. Maybe they truly targeted you for the wrong reasons. Maybe you have a serious complaint and a strong case. Now imagine that during the process of investigating the dispute, or during a lawsuit, or during discovery, the company uncovers messages where you asked a coworker to do something dishonest or against policy. Clock me in if I'm late. Tell them I was there. Can you sign that for me? Just say I completed the training. Cover for me if anyone asks. Use my login and submit it. Don't worry. Nobody will check. Can you backdate this? Delete that message. Say I was on the call. That is a completely different level of risk, because now the employer may argue that regardless of whatever illegal conduct you're complaining about, you engaged in misconduct serious enough that they would have terminated you anyway if they had known about it at the time. That concept is often tied to what lawyers call after-acquired evidence. And this is one of the most dangerous ideas in employment law for employees who leave bad written records behind. The basic logic goes like this. An employer may discover evidence after the fact, sometimes during litigation, sometimes during an internal investigation, sometimes from reviewing messages or interviewing witnesses, that the employee committed a policy violation, dishonesty, fraud, falsification, or some other serious misconduct. The employer then says, even if we handled the original situation improperly, this newly discovered misconduct would have independently justified termination. Now, the exact legal effect of that argument can vary depending on the case and the facts. It doesn't magically erase every wrong the employer committed, but it can dramatically reduce remedies, cut off certain damages, and weaken your leverage in ways that are very painful. In plain English, it can take a case that might have been worth real money and real accountability and slash it down because you gave the company a second, cleaner reason to fire you. That's why these texts are so dangerous. They can turn the conversation away from what the employer did wrong and toward what you did wrong. And once that happens, you're no longer just the employee who was mistreated. You become the employee who was asking coworkers to help commit time fraud, falsify records, ignore compliance rules, fake attendance, hide mistakes, or manipulate company systems. That is not a fight you want to create for yourself. Now let's make this concrete. Suppose you're dealing with a supervisor who has been retaliating against you for months. You've complained about discrimination. You've documented some incidents. You believe the company is trying to push you out. Eventually, you're fired, and you pursue legal action. During the case, the employer gets access to messages between you and a coworker. In one of those texts, from 6 months earlier, you wrote, "Hey, I'm running late. Clock me in and I'll owe you one." Maybe it happened once. Maybe you were desperate. Maybe everyone did it. Maybe the coworker said yes because it seemed minor. Maybe you didn't think of it as fraud at all. But now the company has a text showing you asked someone to falsify a time record. Do you see what happens next? Instead of focusing entirely on the retaliation claim, the company now gets to say, "We do not condone falsification of time records. This is a terminable offense. Had we known about this misconduct, the employee would have been terminated immediately. Any claim for ongoing wages or reinstatement should be limited because this employee engaged in serious dishonesty." And just like that, your case is no longer just about the illegal treatment you endured. It's also about whether your own conduct gave the employer a fallback justification. Or imagine a different version. You miss a required compliance training and text a coworker, "Can you just mark me as done?" Or you ask someone to sign a document you never reviewed. Or you tell a teammate to say you attended a meeting you skipped. Or you ask someone to delete a Slack message because you don't want management to see it. Or you use someone else's credentials to get around a restriction. Or you tell a coworker to change a date, fix a timestamp, or quietly alter a file so it looks like something happened when it didn't. People do these things because they're rushed, scared, embarrassed, overwhelmed, or trying to avoid consequences. They tell themselves it's small. They tell themselves everyone cuts corners. They tell themselves no one will ever know. But the problem is not whether it felt small in the moment. The problem is that the written request often makes it look bigger, more deliberate, and more dishonest than you ever intended. A spoken shortcut is risky enough. A written shortcut becomes a receipt. And once there's a receipt, The company doesn't have to guess what happened. They don't have to infer your intent. They don't have to rely on someone's memory. They can hold up your exact words and say, "Here, this employee asked someone else to help violate policy." That's devastating. Now, I want to pause on something important here. Not all policy violations are equal. Workplaces are messy. Some rules are trivial, selectively enforced, or ignored by everyone. Sometimes employees are pressured into shortcuts by impossible workloads or bad management. Sometimes a so-called violation is not nearly as serious as the company later claims it is. All of that can be true, but none of it changes the core risk of creating a written record that makes you look intentionally deceptive. Because if the employer is already in a defensive posture, if they're trying to defeat your complaint, reduce damages, or protect themselves from liability, they are not going to interpret your message in the most forgiving way possible. They're going to interpret it in the way that helps them most. That means a message you saw as, "Can you do me a favor?" may be reframed as intencional falsification. A message you saw as, "Help me avoid a stupid technicality," may be reframed as knowing policy violation. A message you saw as, "Please cover for me this one time," may be reframed as dishonesty serious enough to warrant termination. This is why I said at the beginning that this fourth category is the most dangerous one on the list. The first three types of messages often create interpretation problems. This one can create independent misconduct problems. It doesn't just hurt your story, it can change the remedy. And the truly frustrating part is that many of these texts are sent during moments of panic, not malice. You overslept and don't want another attendance point. You forgot a deadline and want someone to adjust a record. You missed a training module and don't want your manager to know. You left early and want someone to say you were still there. You're exhausted, cornered, embarrassed, and trying to survive one bad day. But one bad day can be... So what's the safer rule? Never ask a coworker, in writing or otherwise, to lie, falsify, cover, backdate, sign, clock, alter, delete, hide, impersonate, or misrepresent something for you at work. Not just this once. Not because everyone does it. Not because it's unfair. Not because my boss is impossible. Not because I'm the one getting targeted. If the act would make you uncomfortable explaining it in a conference room with HR present, it should never be put in a text message. And if you're in a workplace where you feel pressured to cut corners to survive, that is a separate problem you should handle carefully, not by creating your own written trail of rule breaking. Maybe the real issue is understaffing. Maybe the deadlines are impossible. Maybe management is forcing people into unethical situations. Maybe you need to document that pressure. Maybe you need outside advice. Maybe you need to protect yourself in a more formal way. But asking a coworker to help you break the rules is not protection. It's self-sabotage. It gives the company a future weapon. It gives HR a clean talking point. It gives opposing counsel a theme. And if your case ever becomes a negotiation, it gives the other side leverage they should never have had. Because from that point on, every conversation can shift from, "Why did the employer treat this person unlawfully?" to, "Would the employee have been fired anyway for dishonesty?" That is a brutal shift, and it's one you want to avoid at all costs. So before you ever send a message asking a coworker to cover for you, stop and ask yourself the question that matters most. If my employer found this text tomorrow, would I still be able to defend it with a straight face? If the answer is no, do not send it. And honestly, if you're even hesitating, that hesitation is probably your answer. Because the fastest way to weaken a legitimate complaint is to create your own misconduct file right beside it. And I want to ask you this one, because I think most people have seen some version of it at work. Do you think things like clocking someone in, covering for a missed meeting, or signing off on something small are harmless favors, or are they serious enough that you should never ask for them? Comment below, harmless favor or serious risk. I want to know how you see it. Text ID equals W2Q8N6. Closing. Your coworkers are not your confessional, and your texts are not private. If there's one idea I want to leave you with after this video, it's this. At work, the most dangerous messages are usually not the ones that sound evil. They're the ones that sound casual, the laughing emoji you sent because you felt cornered, the job-hunting text you sent because you trusted a coworker, the rant about your boss you sent because you were furious and needed relief. The "can you cover for me" message you sent because you were panicking and thought it was small. None of those texts may have felt like a career-ending decision in the moment. They may have felt human, understandable, ordinary, even harmless. But workplace disputes are rarely decided by how a message felt when you sent it. They're influenced by how that message looks later, when someone with power reads it in the coldest possible way. That's the shift most employees never prepare for. When you're texting a coworker, you think you're speaking to a person. When the company gets involved, you may actually be speaking to HR, to an investigator, to an executive, to opposing counsel, to a judge, to ayure, to anyone trying to build a story about who you are, why you left, whether you were credible, whether you welcomed certain conduct, whether you had a bad attitude, whether you were planning to leave anyway, or whether the company had some separate reason to fire you. That's why the biggest mistake people make is not just sending a bad text. It's forgetting that workplace texts can stop being personal communication and start becoming legal evidence. And that brings us to the privacy illusion, the false comfort that gets people in trouble over and over again. A lot of employees think, "This is just between me and my coworker. She'd never show anyone. He's my friend. It's in a private text thread. It's on Signal. It's in DMs. It's in Slack, but only in a small chat. No one's ever going to see this." That belief is dangerous, because if there's an internal investigation, HR may ask coworkers for relevant communications. If there's a lawsuit, lawyers can demand documents and messages through discovery. If a court orders production, people may be required to turn over texts, emails, chats, screenshots, and records related to the dispute. If a coworker feels pressure to protect themselves, they may cooperate even if they once promised they never would. If the relationship changes, if fear sets in, if loyalty cracks, or if someone simply wants to stay out of trouble, your private conversation may stop being private very quickly. And that doesn't mean everyone around you is disloyal. It means work is not friendship in the legal sense. Coworkers are not your vault. They are not your therapist. They are not your protected diary. They are people inside the same system, under the same pressure, trying to protect their own jobs, their own families, and their own future. You have to understand that if you want to protect yourself, because the moment a workplace problem becomes serious, every person involved starts recalculating risk. People who swore they'd never share anything may suddenly be sitting in an interview with HR, being asked direct questions. Or they may get a call from a lawyer asking them to preserve and produce messages. Or they may realize that withholding information could put them in danger too. That's when the illusion breaks. And once it breaks, your messages don't belong to the emotional moment that created them anymore. They belong to the record. So what's the golden rule? Before you send any message to a coworker, especially when you're angry, uncomfortable, afraid, embarrassed, or desperate, pause and picture that message enlarged on a screen in a courtroom, in an HR conference room, or in a meeting with company leadership. Imagine your words with your name on them. No tone, no context, no private explanation, no chance to interrupt, just the text. Then ask yourself, would I still send this if I knew a judge might read it? Would I still send this if HR printed it out? Would I still send this if the company used it to explain why I deserved what happened? Would I still send this if my future income, reputation, or legal claim depended on how this message sounded? If the answer is no, do not send it. That one habit will protect you more than most people realize. Because being careful with workplace communication is not about becoming drobotic, drives. It's not about never trusting anyone or never expressing emotion. It's about understanding the environment you're in. Workplaces keep records. Companies protect themselves. Lawyers look for inconsistencies. Investigations rarely care about what you meant if your words can be framed another way. So your goal is simple. Stop giving other people the raw material to tell the wrong story about you. If someone sends you something inappropriate, don't respond in a way that makes it look welcome. If you're planning your exit from a toxic workplace, Don't create texts that make it sound like you were just chasing a better offer. If your boss is making your life miserable, don't turn your anger into written ammunition. And if you're ever tempted to ask a coworker to bend the rules, fake something, cover for you, or clean up a problem dishonestly, don't do it because that one message can do more damage than the original workplace issue ever did. Protect your peace. Yes. Protect your career. Absolutely. But also protect the record, because in the modern workplace, what hurts people is often not just what happened to them. It's what they accidentally wrote while it was happening. And if this video made you rethink the way you message people at work, let me know in the comments with one word. Careful if you're going to be more cautious from now on, or same if this confirmed rules you already live by. I read the comments, and I genuinely love to know which part hit hardest for you. And if you know someone who vents to coworkers, jokes through uncomfortable messages, or treats work texts like they disappear into thin air, send them this video. It might save them from making a mistake that follows them for years. Protect your words, protect your record, and I'll see you in the next one.